All right, Joel Klatt, host of the newly launched Joel Klatt Show. Man, I'm so glad to meet you. So glad to have you on the show today. I want to start with, I think, one of your favorite subjects, certainly one of my favorite subjects, and that is parity. College football, fairness, and whether or not we just have to resign ourselves to a future of Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, and Georgia. Is there anything this year, Joel, that tells you that 2022 will be any different or any more full of surprises?
Well, this is a great question. And I've thought a lot about this, like how to increase parity, how to get college football to a place where we don't automatically know that Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia are going to be in the playoff this year. And the hard part about it, just to give you like some degree of context about how far ahead they are, and you can kind of put Clemson in there, but the numbers actually suggest something a little bit different. When you take a look at just the talent disparity in college football, Will, what you'll see is that the top three schools in the poll right now, right? So the ones I mentioned, Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State, those three are vastly ahead from a talent perspective. So from recruiting rankings, you can kind of get a picture of what a roster is from a talent basis. And you can put a number on that. You can get basically like, what is your average player? What is the average player on those rosters, and what is the average player ranked? And if you take a look at the disparity between Alabama, who's number one in the talent composite right now, and like let's say the 11th best talented roster in the country, which is USC. And USC is a top 10 team. We would think, man, they're really good, and they're close to Alabama. But the difference between Alabama and USC, who's number 11, is the exact same difference mathematically from USC, which is 11, all the way to 69, which is Florida Atlantic. So Florida Atlantic is the exact same difference between USC as USC to Alabama. So we've got a bell curve right now of talent, and we need to even it out. So that's the problem. How do you fix it? Well, I think part of the fix is going to be expand the postseason and expand the playoff. And people have wondered, like, well, why would that make any difference? Well, right now, we have a 4-team playoff in college football, and it's far too exclusive. And so those teams that have been annually, really, they're the only ones that can go into a living room of a recruit and say, like, listen, if you want to compete for a championship and play in the playoff, you've got to come to our school, because the numbers bear that out. So the more schools that we offer the opportunity to define themselves as successful, to go to the postseason, I think what we'll start to see is a bit of evening out of talent across, let's say, the top 15 or 20 schools rather than just the top 4 or 5.
I'm with you, and I've heard you make that argument, and it makes total sense. Do you give any credence? And I don't. Look, Joel, for several years I've said an expanded playoffs would not diminish the value of games during the regular season. There are people that think that is the case. A, do you think that is the case? And then if not, B, what's the right number then? Is 12? And if 12 doesn't water down the regular season, should you go to 16? What's the right number then for you to maximize parity but also entertainment a season long?
Yeah, great question, and important questions for the health of the sport long term. You're in the exact right vein. I love it. You clearly are a huge fan of the sport. So first of all, I don't think that an expanded playoff is going to hurt the regular season. In fact, I think it might expand the number of games that we deem as important. Right now, a team loses one time, and as far as their postseason hopes go, you have a hard time arguing that the rest of their games are important in terms of that model. Because of that, I think that the more teams we can keep relevant as it relates to the postseason later into the season, you have a more important regular season. You have more interest across more games throughout the regular season. As far as the number of teams that I think is kind of the sweet spot for the playoff, I'm a 12-team advocate, and the reason is that you can make an argument that if you expand the playoff, then the games for the best teams don't matter because they know they're going to be in. So how do you fix that problem? How do you fix the problem of Alabama and Georgia playing in the SEC championship game and everyone knowing that they're both going to the postseason? So what does that game matter? Well, you've got to attach some significance to that game, and you do that through the number of teams in the postseason. You do that with a 12-team playoff. And with a 12-team playoff, you can have 4 buys. you can have 4 teams get a first-round bye, meaning that the 4 best teams in the country still have a massive amount to play for, even at the end when they know that they're in and they're playing another team that they know that they're in. When you get to 16, you don't have those byes. When you get to 14, you only have 2 byes. So 12 to me is a bit of a sweet spot that you can have 4 byes, you can have 6 at-large teams, you can have the 6 best conference champions throughout college football. You're rewarding small conferences. And the more I've thought about it, the more that I've played it out in my head and talked with other people around college football, I really do think 12 is the right number.
Okay, so you're right. I am a big college football fan, so I'm not.
I love it.
I'm not going to be wielding this information as some type of bona fides or resume here, but because I'm like truly into this conversation. Okay, because I talk about sports here on the Cain Podcast, and I have talked about it for years at ESPN. I have spent in the past week, Joel, on 24/7's Talent Composite Index. And the reason that I did, in reference to your first point, is because I wanted to see how big of an upset it is for App State to take down Texas A&M. And if I remember correctly, I think Appalachian State's talent composite came in at something like 109th in the country. And Texas A&M's 4th. And by the way, Texas A&M just got a huge commitment yesterday, 5-star defensive lineman, maybe the best defensive lineman in the country. So they continue to rack up huge talent. If that's the case, and if talent composite means so much as you laid out, how do we get Appalachian State beating Texas A&M? How do we get BYU, for that matter, beating Baylor, which was also a huge gap? How do we get these upsets?
Or even Kent State playing semi-tough against Georgia, or even Notre Dame, playing a great game against Ohio State. I think what you have to understand is that it has to do with probability. It doesn't mean that there's 0 chance that it can happen. It's just a very minimal chance that it can happen. But it's still a sport that is, at least between the lines, governed by discipline, effort, details, and in particular, execution. So to give you a little bit of a sense of that, if I'm a quarterback and I'm just going to run one concept, let's call it like, bounce to tray right zip, 2-jet Z drive X out. Right? And you're going to call a play like that. There's so many moving parts and details that have to be executed correctly by your 11 in order for that concept to be successful. First of all, you've got to be in the right personnel group. So it's 11 personnel, 1 tight end, 1 back. You got to get in the right formation. You're going to bounce to tray right, which is a formation. The Z is on the outside of the F, and the F is just on the outside of the tight end. The X is on the left side. Now you're going to zip the Z down, inside motion. He's not going across the ball, so he's got to get to the right snap point. Then you're going to run 2-jet Z drive. The protection has to be right. They have to identify the right linebacker. They're going number 1, weak to strong. There is a mountain of details on every single play. I'm barely getting through the formation, and you get the idea of what this sport is all about. And so to answer your question, when you've got 18 to 23, 24-year-olds that are distracted on a week-in and week-out basis, when they can get full of themselves on a week-in and week-out basis, what you have is a team like OU that can go out and play an unbelievably sound game against Nebraska one week, and the next week go out and commit 11 penalties, and their quarterback is throwing the ball, all over the lot, missing wide receivers. He's not on time, because details and execution really matter. And so even when you get the huge talent gaps, there are those small slivers of chances that when you out-execute and out-detail and out-effort a team, you can still win.
Okay. I understand the answer about probabilities. I don't love the answer. I'll be real with you, Joel. And here's why. Because those probabilities exist for both sides of the field, for both sidelines, for both locker rooms. Each team is dealing with those variations of dealing with 18-year-olds and inconsistency. And so what I would say to you is this, and I'm going to, look, I take no pride in saying this. In fact, I hate that I have to move here. As you know, I live in Texas. Yeah. I'm a huge Longhorn. And so what I see now is I see a team, a program that recruits at a very high level on a consistent basis, whether or not your head coach is Mac Brown, Charlie Strong, Tom Herman, or Steve Sarkisian. Most of the time, top 5, almost always top 10 in recruiting. So they're well up there in Talent Composite Index. But yet they are they're more inconsistent and more underachieving than almost any other program out there.
They've fallen woefully
me,
short. You're exactly right.
Yeah, and so which says to me there's a problem here symbolized by Texas that is more than just the probabilities where talent falls short. And it could be player, could be coach, could be development. With Texas, all the variables have been changed is the problem, and yet the problem remains.
So this is absolutely the case, and this is harder to answer, but there are a few directions that you can answer. One of the answers is built into the question. You said Mac Brown, Charlie Strong, Tom Herman, Steve Sarkisian, they've been inconsistent across their coaching staff. Consistency is rewarded with young adults. You know that as a parent, you know that as a teacher, and that's the same in college football. So when it doesn't go right and you have high expectations and you miss on one recruiting class, when you have the wrong injury and it starts going south, when you've got assistant coaches that leave and you start getting 3 and 4 different offensive coordinators over a 4 and 5 year span, all of a sudden you can take a dip. Then all of a sudden the expectations are higher than the dip, and you say, this has got to change and we're going to go in a different direction. Now you change leadership. At Texas in particular, in the last decade, they had a major shift in university leadership. And I thought that they had to get that in order before they could ever get the football program in order. So there are so many different answers. And then you also have to look at just a particular staff ability to develop their players and to get the most out of their players. Nobody does it better than Nick Saban. First of all, no one has better players than Nick Saban, but no one gets the most out of their players more so than Nick Saban.
Really quickly, Joel, what's fascinating about that is while changing out his staff, while constantly changing out every other element of the coaching staff that I know of, except for Nick Saban.
Yeah. He's pretty remarkable. I wish I could do more Alabama games. As you know, I did the Texas Alabama game earlier this year, and it was the first time I've ever gotten to do an Alabama game. And what I love about doing games with all these programs is that you get to basically immerse yourself and get to really know the coaching staff and the culture that week. And it was the first chance that I got with Nick Saban. And what I was enthralled with is this standard that he holds that everybody else is in awe of at all times. You know, I had everyone, whether it was Bill O'Brien, the current offensive coordinator, or Steve Sarkisian, who was going to be his opposing head coach that week, who was his former offensive coordinator, or if it was the sports information director, Josh Maxson, everybody just talked about, listen, if you don't love football, and if you aren't ready to grind on Monday morning at 7:30 and Tuesday morning at 7:30 and Wednesday morning at 7:30, then this place isn't for you. He sets a standard that's just higher than most other places. And I believe it's that reason why he's been able to find consistency and to achieve at the highest level, even with a cycle of assistant coaches and cycles of recruits. It is so rare, Will, so rare. And people think that like, oh, you know, this program's just going to win. When you look throughout history, even the greatest coaches in history rarely won national championships with 2 different sets of recruits or a different total staff under them. Generally speaking, they win a championship in pockets with one group of player and one staff, and then it's incredibly difficult for them to ever get back to that point when that thing changes out. Nick Saban is a total exception to the rule when it comes to the success and longevity of success in college football.
Okay, one more self-indulgence on Texas. Let me ask you this.
I love it.
If Quinn Ewers doesn't get hurt in the first quarter of that game, which you called against Alabama, what would Texas's record be right now?
4-0.
I agree.
I think they would be undefeated.
Joel,
I think
absolutely. And what that says to me is I think there's 2 things that I take away from that's fascinating. One, the power of narrative, right? So right now it's, oh my gosh, is Sarkisian yet another Tom Herman? Is this going to fall apart? You know, he's got a horrible record in Big 12 play, a horrible record in top 25 play, a horrible record on the road. And now all that's at the forefront. If Ewers had stayed healthy and they're 4-0, the conversation would be how great the program Sarkisian is and that Ewers is a Heisman candidate. So different, but both things would be true at the same time. I think all those problems with Sarkisian would still exist under the surface, But yet, Joel, we may not know those problems. You could argue we may not know those problems for 5 or 6 years, because if Ewers is the guy we think he is, and then if March Manning comes in and he's the guy everybody thinks he will be, you'd never know.
Yeah.
But today, the narrative's entirely different.
Yeah, narrative is a strong thing in college football. I think in the state of Texas this week in particular, it's a case study in narrative. Here's Texas that gets their quarterback. They're going to beat Alabama. They probably should have beat them anyways, save for some really horrendous officiating. But they didn't. They lost by 1. It was a great game. I said immediately after the game, they're going to lose a game before Red River without Quinn Ewers. And sure enough, that happened last week against Texas Tech. So now this narrative bubbles up like you eloquently put. Meanwhile, in College Station, they lose to App State, then get totally outplayed at home by Miami, and Miami can't do anything in the red zone. So they end up losing. Miami loses the game. A&M wins. They beat Miami. Miami didn't have Restrepo. They were, A&M wins. Then they go and play Arkansas in AT&T Stadium. KJ Jefferson decides that he's Michael Jordan. He's going to double foot jump from the 5-yard line, and I'm still baffled by that decision. A&M ends up winning the game because a kick goes off the top of the upright and bounces straight up into the air. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And now the narrative around Texas A&M, vastly different. It's like, oh, well, they're doing great and Jimbo's really on the right track, when in reality, the last 2 games easily could have gone the opposite direction. Those 2 games that we're talking about for Texas easily could have gone the opposite direction. So the power of narrative, and shoot, man, you deal with this in a much larger sense, even in the real world, as I like to call it. The power of narrative is so strong. And in large respect, it takes over truth. And we have such a hard time actually defining something for what it is at the moment.
All right, so I want to ask you some questions about some other programs across the country, but let's start this. So last year, it was pretty fascinating. We saw something new. I think it's fairly new. We never have seen two, what I would have considered, Joel, untouchable programs. In other words, you climb the coaching mountain and you arrive at some point at the peak. And once you arrive at that peak, you're there, you get all the money you want, you have all the legendary status that you want, and you don't make a parallel move to another Tier 1 program. So we saw Lincoln Riley go from OU to USC. We saw Brian Kelly go from Notre Dame to LSU. So clearly what I thought, maybe what you thought, wasn't true or is no longer true. Programs can steal coaches from other programs on their same level. Will that happen again this year? Who will be the Lincoln Riley and Brian Kelly, and what will be the program that can money whip some big-time coach to come over to their sideline?
It's a great question. I don't think it's going to happen this year, because I don't sense that we're going to have brands like USC and LSU and Florida coming open and Miami coming open. It was a perfect storm of kind of, leverage is everything in this world when it comes to job status and salary. And because all of those great jobs were open, it was a coach's market. It was a huge coach's market. We had just seen Mel Tucker leverage the open LSU job for a 10-year, $90 million contract with Michigan State. At the time, he was basically a 500 head coach. It's wild. James Franklin leverages the open position at USC for a 10-year, $75 million contract at Penn State. Mario Cristobal leaves Oregon. He goes to Miami. Then all of a sudden, Lincoln Riley. When it comes to Lincoln Riley and Brian Kelly, I was shocked that what happened. But, and this is gonna sound awful. We're all for sale. To some extent.
Yeah.
At some point, USC offered Lincoln Riley over $100 million. I'm sorry, folks. He was going to go take that. And Brian Kelly, similar at LSU. And so I think that the status of their current job was almost irrelevant at that point. When you put that type of figure in front of someone, I think that, it changes the math, if you will. And then that being said, I also feel like in Brian Kelly from Notre Dame to LSU and Lincoln Riley from Oklahoma to USC, I got the sense that each of those guys felt like they maybe had maxed out at their current spot. Riley had been to the playoff several times over. Brian Kelly had been to the playoff. And I don't know if they felt like they were in a position where at those places they could take the next step and win playoff games and win a national championship. And they went to places where they felt like they could. Remember,
do you agree with that? Do you think they would have been right in that assessment?
Some respect.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
In some respect, only in this respect. There's only a few places where you don't have to get on a plane and you can recruit a top class in the country. And USC is one of those in Southern California. LSU is close to one of those. Georgia is one of those. Texas is one of those. Maybe Texas A&M, Miami is one of those.
I would think Oklahoma would be.
Well, they've got to go win the battles in Texas. They cannot, just recruit in Oklahoma and get a top class in the country. And Notre Dame, that's certainly the case, in particular with some of the academic standards that they have and requirements that they have. So I don't know if I totally agree, with my point. I know that sounds weird, but I think that there's
no, it's not your point. I don't think your point is incorrect. Yeah, I don't disagree with your point. I disagree maybe with Riley and Kelly's analysis of their own job, which they know much better than I do on the limitations of their own recruiting ability. But look, as a born and raised Texan, Oklahoma recruits Texas as though it were in Texas. It's no problem that it's in Oklahoma, right? And Notre Dame I can see tougher because they don't have a geographic base, but they just have such that brand that I would think there's no limitations on recruiting.
The academic side of the Notre Dame thing, and to their credit, they say this is who we are and this is what our standards are going to be, and then they've excelled regardless. It's a really great institution, but yeah, I think that the academic side for Notre Dame has been a hindrance.
Do you think, and I remember having this debate, I've been having this debate I've been at Fox for 2 years, was at ESPN for 5 years, so probably been having this debate for at least 4 to 5 years. Nebraska, can it ever, I don't even want to ask you, can it ever again be Nebraska? Because the 80s and 90s are a long time ago, and it was a unique time, I think, as well in history. But look, still in most people, how about this? Certainly in the fan base's sense of expectation, I think even in the mind of the college football fan, Nebraska ought to be, I don't know, at least a tier 2 program. I mean, can Nebraska ever again even get close to living up to expectations?
Life is all about expectation management, and I don't see a path back to 94 through 97 Nebraska. That was a program that was the Alabama of the age, right? I mean, when you look at the mid-90s, Notre Dame and Ohio State and Alabama and Texas would have done anything to be Nebraska. They were the preeminent program in the country. The 95 Nebraska Cornhuskers, I still believe, are probably the best team ever, or certainly close and in the conversation. They, I saw a stat, and I'm going to round the numbers. They were something like 65-1 over a 3-year stretch in the regular season, which is mind-boggling, right? Mind-boggling. Not even Alabama is doing things like that. So can they get back to that? I think that's going to be incredibly tough for them to get back to that. Now, to your point, should they be at a minimum a tier 2 team that could compete for things like division titles in the Big Ten West? Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no reason in the world that Nebraska can't be what Wisconsin has become and what Iowa has become.
That's who I was thinking.
Yes. And I totally agree with that. And we go back to kind of when you start missing on coaches and you're trying to bring in different cultures and I mean, I thought Scott Frost was going to work, but then you look up and he's 5 years into it. And he had 2 players on his roster that were seniors that started their careers at Nebraska. So the culture was far too transient. There was no culture. And so, I hope Nebraska can get back to that. Even as a kid that grew up in Colorado and rooted against Nebraska, I certainly hope that they can get back to that point.
And played against Nebraska as well, obviously. Hey, so I actually, Wisconsin is a fascinating program. I'm glad you brought them up. So, and I'm trying to think if there's an SEC corollary. Wisconsin essentially exists on the opposite end of the spectrum of Texas. Here's Texas that has no problem recruiting and yet underdevelops players and certainly performs below expectations. Wisconsin doesn't recruit at that level, and yet consistently and through now multiple coaching staffs, it's just a terrible team to play. Nobody wants to play Wisconsin. They can win the Big Ten West.
It's true.
But you know what? But then here's my question for you. So I have a twofold question for you. You brought up culture. What is that, man? Is that because again, you change out components, you change coaching staff, you change classes, recruiting classes, pods of players, 4-year groups of players, but yet the reputation and culture seems to stay. So, A, where does that culture come from if you can change out coaches and it remains? And B, though, why is there seemingly a ceiling on teams like Wisconsin, programs like Wisconsin?
So
they don't become tier one.
Yeah. So that part of your question is just top end talent. Like that's where like there is a ceiling on development, and they just don't get the players that are in those top 5 programs. Now that doesn't mean that they can't go and compete at a really high level. I think that what you're talking about has to do with culture, yes, but that culture is forged through a very specific identity, and they really know themselves. So when they're going through hires, they're just not trying to go buy the best and biggest name to come in and install whatever they were doing at that location, and let's see if it works here. They have a tried and true blueprint, and regardless of the person that's going to take the wheel of that bus, it's going to be the same bus, and they're going to drive it in the very similar fashion. They know how to recruit to that identity. They get the best offensive linemen from around the Midwest, if you will, and in particular in Wisconsin, they've got a really good running back all the time, and they're going to play great defense. All the time. They're going to play great defense, and they're going to find a nose guard. They're going to find linebackers that can play. They're going to find edge players that can play. Their secondary is aggressive. It's maddening for other teams because they all feel like, why can't we do what Wisconsin does? And what they don't understand is Wisconsin's got a 30-year head start from the day Barry Alvarez stepped foot on that campus. When he left Notre Dame as the defensive coordinator, took the job at Wisconsin. From that moment, that identity has been forged. And they're
Joel,
consistent with it.
Is there an identity team? Is there a program? I'm sitting here trying to think as you're talking about how unique that is. And I'm trying to think, who would be the Wisconsin of the Pac-12, of the SEC, of the Big 12? And
I don't think that there is
I don't have
one.
easy answers to that.
I don't think that there is one. I think that they're very unique in that regard. And what's interesting is that you've got a couple of those schools, maybe 3, in that division. I think Iowa is the same way. Kirk Ferentz has been there forever. He's been the longest tenured coach in college football. And I think Pat Fitzgerald at Northwestern is also similar. Now, they're going to ride the waves of talent a little bit more than those other programs. But it's really hard to find those types of teams elsewhere. It's just incredibly rare. I don't think you can find a team like that in the SEC. I don't think you can find a team like that in the Pac-12. The team that's closest to that outside of the Big Ten footprint, I would actually say, is Oklahoma State because of the longevity of Mike Gundy.
I thought you might go Texas Tech, an identity that began with Leach. Just shoot it out, score as many points as you can. But they haven't had the success, obviously, on a consistent basis. Right, but I do think that identity.
They do have an identity, and it's worked for them. And when they stay within that, it has worked. I would say Oklahoma State has had a more successful run, because we've had some moments where they could play all the way. They win the Big 12 last year, and there's a chance that they were going to go to the playoff. They could have gone to a BCS national championship game. So, I mean, that's the one. I think Mike Gundy does a nice job, but boy, it's hard. It's really hard to identify programs that do it as well from an identity perspective as Wisconsin and Iowa for that regard.
I just have a few minutes left with you, but I have 2 more subjects at least I want to hit. So first of all, you had a fascinating answer to this. I did this on Monday's edition of my podcast. I think at this point, the rumors of Deion Sanders, head coach of Jackson State, being a candidate at places like Nebraska, Arizona State, and Georgia Tech are so off because I actually think those jobs are beneath Deion at this point in terms of his market. And I guess you might agree because you had a fascinating potential program for Deion.
I brought him up at Auburn. Now, I will say Deion has said and expressed an interest of being at Jackson State and building HBCU football. And that's awesome. And if he wants to do that, that's fantastic. And he's getting really good players down there. That being said, to me, I don't think he has to go to one of these other places and try to build something in a different conference. Auburn has expectations at the highest end of college football. They have won national championships. They have played for national championships in the last 20 years. And in order to get back to that point, they're going to have to look in the mirror and realize that their head coach is going to have to win recruiting battles in the living room against the likes of Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, Steve Sarkisian, Jimbo Fisher, Brian Kelly. So when you develop a list of guys, Dabo Swinney, of guys that can win those battles, Mario Cristobal is now going to be in that. Boy, that's a small list, right? Well, what's a name that pops up that gets in the room every time? Deion Sanders. So I don't know if that's the case at Auburn. I don't know if he's going to be a candidate. It was purely speculative, but from my seat, it makes sense.
Okay. Let's go back to the upsets for one more moment and the talent. I have a theory. I want to hear your response to this. So App State beats Texas A&M. We see increasing number of examples this year of not just what we would say in college basketball is mid-major programs, but even below mid-major programs playing top-tier programs, often to a victory. If a mid-major went to the Final Four, and it happens in college basketball, we would talk about, well, the talent isn't the level of North Carolina, Duke, Kansas, but these guys are seniors. They're four-year seniors. They've been together. They have consistency, and they know how to play together. They have, in short, chemistry. Is that applicable to college football? With the transfer portal and guys moving around, does this also have a downstream domino effect of programs like App State, who might have guys who've been there for 4 years playing together? Is there a path here for success for the little guy of looking at college basketball and saying experience and consistency and chemistry is how we play the big guys?
I don't think at the mid-major, because basketball is so different in that one great player makes a much bigger difference than one great player in football. Because of what I was talking about earlier, with just like the details and the execution, it's more of a team game than basketball. Now, I do think it's important that we start to reward those types of programs that have great seasons with berths in the highest postseason. Now, do I think that they're going to get all the way to the Final Four and win? I have my doubts about that, but this is why that model that I was talking about, where you've got the 6 best conference champions from around college football, well, that's one more than the power conferences. So the fact that we could get, in the future, a Sun Belt team in that postseason, and that they're going to play in the first round, and maybe they would host a game in the first round, and maybe they could win a game in the first round, I think we will see that. I just have my questions about a roster, even if it's experienced and develops and has the chemistry, a roster at a group of 5 school going all the way to the Final Four. I think what you would have to do is you would have to liken this more to, could Wisconsin do it? Could, Oklahoma State do it? Could they get the right roster to then go and compete with the teams that are recruiting in the top 5 in college football?
Okay, last question for you. You've just launched this season, the Joel Klatt Show. I know one of the things you're really passionate about, Joel, is fairness. And I think that's fascinating. And I think the conversation I've had for the past 40 minutes has been about parity and how to include more programs in the conversation every year. But here's why. I want to know why that's important to you, because there's an implication in there. And that is, and I don't think you're wrong, but I think there's an implication there that for many commentators, perhaps, or analysts, or much of the college football world, it's not fair, meaning how it talks about it, who it gives a shot to, maybe even preseason rankings. Am I right? Is that your implication?
Yes.
And why is it unfair?
Yes. So in college football, as opposed to, certainly the NFL, and I'm not saying that we've got to be the NFL, but we perpetually reward the best, and then we expect the least from them. So they have the lowest barrier to entry. We just assume that they're really good. So if Alabama is to slip up and lose a game, we're like, oh, well, they'll still be there in the end. And we give them the benefit of the doubt in the end. And I think it should be the opposite. Those that have much should be expected. I think that we should change the way schedules are made so that the best teams in the country that play the best football on an annual basis have to play the toughest schedules. I think that would be a better model, because right now the barrier to entry is on the little guy, and I don't think that's how it should be. So it's more about that. Do I think that we have to, tear Alabama down? No, that's not what I'm talking about. I want to reward greatness, and I think that Alabama, if they are great, should be great and have the ability to sustain that greatness. But too much that is given, much should be expected. And we've got to stop with the light road for the best programs. They get to play the easiest schedules. They get to play at home more than everybody else. They get the best players. They have the most money. They have the biggest staff. They've got the best coaches. And then we give them the benefit of the doubt over the little guy when they each lose a game. Well, that needs to change somehow. Defining how we get to the postseason is a big point of that. And then also, I think changing the way we schedule in the non-conference is also a big part of that. Again, I think that the best teams in the country, where they finished the previous season, should dictate the strength of schedule of what they're facing the next season.
I'm up for including more programs. I'm up for a meritocracy in the end. Hey, look, I look forward to listening to the Joel Klatt Show more, man. And I'm really glad to have you on the show today. I know you got a busy day and a busy weekend ahead of you, so thank you for making time for us.
This was a blast. I love having discussions about college football. It's near and dear to my heart, and been a pleasure being on, man. Big fan.
All right, thanks, Joel. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.